The Media Institute, the foremost independent advocate for the First Amendment for over 4 decades, is one of the nation's leading nonpartisan organizations focused on media and communications policy. The Media Institute promotes freedom of speech, recognizes excellence in journalism, and encourages a competitive media environment and communications industry. Considering the current state of affairs in the nation's capital and across the country, our mission has never been more relevant. As we gather virtually for this month's Communications Forum, the Media Institute wishes to recognize our sponsors and supporters. APTS, ACA, AT&T, Charter, CTA, CPB, Covington, Cox, CTIA, Davis Wright, Disney, DLA Piper, HC2, Howard Stirk, iHeart, IAB, ION, Lehrman Center, LG, NAB, NBC Universal, NCTA, NMA, Nixon Peabody, Sinclair, Tegna, T-Mobile, US Telecom, Verizon, Viacom CBS, Wiley, and Wilkinson Barker Knauer. Thank you. And now the President and CEO of the Media Institute, Rick Kapler.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second virtual Communications Forum Luncheon. I hope you enjoyed our first virtual event last month, and I'm glad to welcome you back today. Many thanks to our luncheon sponsors. Your support makes this series possible, and we're very grateful to you. I especially want to thank John Taylor of LG Electronics and Dave Arland of Arland Communications for helping us come to you in this virtual format today. Just a brief word about our upcoming events. On August 27th, our speaker will be Stuart Brotman. I'm proud to say that Stuart is the Media Institute's new Distinguished Fellow and is the author of a brand new book on digital privacy. The title of his book is Privacy's Perfect Storm, Digital Policy for Post-Pandemic Times. I think that title says it all. He'll give us some unique insights into privacy issues facing media, telecom, and digital providers. And then on September 21st, our speaker will be the well-known political analyst, Charlie Cook. This will be just 6 weeks before Election Day, so we'll be very eager to see what Charlie is predicting for the big races, including that race for the White House. That date again is September 21st. It's now a great pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker. Commissioner Michael O'Rielly has been an FCC Commissioner since November of 2013. And he began a second term in January 2015. I'm happy to say that he was just confirmed last week for a third term that started July 1st. Commissioner O'Rielly came to the FCC from Capitol Hill, where he spent almost 20 years on both the House and Senate sides. From 2010 to 2013, he held several positions, including Policy Director in the Office of the Senate Republican Whip. Before that, he worked for the Senate Republican Policy Committee as a policy analyst. He began his Senate career in 2003, working for Senator John Sununu as a senior legislative assistant and then as legislative director. Commissioner O'Rielly began his House career in 1994, working for Congressman Tom Bliley, and then went on to the House Energy and Commerce Committee, where he worked until 2003. Commissioner Mike has been a great friend of the Media Institute over the years as a luncheon speaker and as the keynote speaker at our gala in 2018. He shares the same values that we hold dear: sound communications policy, a competitive media industry, and a strong First Amendment. He was supposed to be our speaker back in March, but then, well, you know what happened. However, he's here with us today and well worth the wait. Before I turn the program over to him, let me first say a brief word about our Q&A session and how you can participate. You'll see a feature on your screen called Ask a Question, and I invite you, as Commissioner O'Rielly is speaking, to type in your questions, and we'll collect them here, and I'll ask as many as I can at the end of the presentation. And now it gives me great pleasure to welcome our very distinguished speaker, the Honorable Michael O'Rielly.
Thank you, Rick, for that very kind introduction, and to the Media Institute, for whom I share so many common values and beliefs, for its efforts over the years to promote First Amendment ideas. Hearing Rick scroll through my past work is just another reminder how old I've become and how quickly the years have flown by. I must, though, make one clarification so as not to impinge upon the prerogatives of the U.S. Senate. With deep appreciation, my nomination was approved last week by the Senate Commerce Committee. While this is absolutely great news, I still have another significant step ahead, consideration by the full Senate before I can begin a new FCC term. Suffice it to say, when I accepted the Media Institute's gracious invitation to join you as luncheon speaker many months ago, the state of the world was very different. After multiple postponements, hoping for a reprieve in a fully open Washington, D.C., it became clear that an in-person event was not meant to be. So I gladly join you virtually from the confines of my own home. And by confines, I really mean confinement, as anyone who's been quarantined 20 straight weeks with a toddler and a 5-year-old can probably relate. In all seriousness, I realize no one is looking to me, a wonkish commissioner of a small federal agency, for sage words of comfort during this difficult time. That being said, my heart goes out to all those who've experienced illness or loss, and I extend my deepest appreciation to everyone on the front lines battling this pandemic. In the absence of delusions of grandeur, I thought it more appropriate to share some wisdom from someone more experienced on the subject of leadership during trying times. My father-in-law is a longtime fan of Sir Winston Churchill and often sends me quotes attributed to him, one of which I found quite relevant to our current situation. In 1940, as the Nazis shifted from bombing England's air bases to attacking its people, the great statesman gave a speech with the following memorable line: "But we shall rather draw from the heart of suffering itself the means of inspiration and survival." The American people's strength and resourcefulness during this hideous pandemic has been amazing to behold. As long as I'm quoting Churchill, he also said, if you have an important point to make, don't try to be subtle or clever. Use a pile driver. Hit it the point once, then come back and hit it again, then hit it a third time, a tremendous whack. Taking this advice to heart, let's turn now to some important policy matters that I have discussed once or twice before, but hopefully remain of interest to this audience. Let me start with what is likely an eye-popping data point for even those watching. Variety magazine recently reported that last year, a leading high-tech company known for streaming over-the-top video content reportedly launched more original content in 1 year than had been released in a single year a decade ago by the entire cable industry combined. At the same time, in recent months, we've witnessed multiple major cable and broadcast networks launch their own OTT platforms to deliver programming directly to consumers, rightfully bypassing stodgy, outdated FCC regulations. If you're a consumer who likes video content, there's never been a better time. The upheaval of the last several years is redefining what it means to be a media company. And while many are straddling both the legacy and high-tech unregulated worlds as hybrid operators for the time being, we should expect to see continued restructuring in the near term and a declining role for the FCC in the longer run. The changing times are not necessarily bad for legacy providers. True, it is disconcerting for any company, whether new or old, to feel the ground constantly shifting beneath its feet. But many of these changes have come about so quickly that the consumer benefits have been widely accepted long before myopic, self-preserving regulators have had a chance to regulate away innovation. In the OTT context, we are getting a rare look into an almost completely unregulated free market bound only by general consumer protection laws and private negotiations. While I'm not insensitive to the fact that the market will cause short-term pain for what some companies and their employees, what we have generally seen so far is that less regulation breeds innovation and expands the overall market for content production and distribution, while increasing access and lowering prices for consumers, a far more beneficial outcome than forcing incumbents to fight for shares of a static pie. Not to be outdone by the invisible hand, though, certain regulators nonetheless won't acknowledge today's reality and continue to hang on to conventional wisdom that hasn't been relevant since the days of the fictional madmen, well, when television advertising was in its nascent stages. For example, in reviewing mergers, the Department of Justice has repeatedly and inexplicably failed to properly identify relevant advertising market participants. We have seen the data. There is no question that in DMAs across the country, urban and rural, certain high-tech companies are taking an increasing share of local advertising. Yet when, God forbid, two television or two radio stations in a market seek to combine, DOJ absolutely refuses to consider the existence of non-broadcast ad sales in its overall analysis. That's not to say that there isn't any good news for legacy media despite these challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic has revealed that local journalism is as important as ever, and while the specter of lower ad sales lingers, the strength of local television news has remained steady. For example, as I wrote about in a recent blog post, in Sioux Falls, we've seen continued expansion of local news due to the combination of two stations that can now more effectively share resources. The outcome offers a clear illustration of what is possible if regulators, such as the FCC or DOJ, would update their view of appropriate market definitions. This year, we're also seeing the fruits of the private sector's efforts to facilitate next-gen TV. Several markets have come online and more are expected this year, despite the pandemic's briefly slowing the progress. As someone who has been on the forefront of facilitating the Commission's piece in this effort, it is certainly exciting to think about how the implementation of ATSC 3.0 can significantly update over-the-air products and services. To date, we have seen just over half dozen markets light up with a handful in the pipeline. And by end of the year, we could possibly double these numbers just in time for the first consumer equipment to reach the neighborhood Best Buy or a shopper's Amazon cart. Notably, the next-gen TV process has been one of the few opportunities for broadcasters to make their own decisions about deployment without constantly looking over their shoulder at a regulator for permission. In limited and targeted ways, the Commission has considered where rules updates are needed, such as in our recent second report and order. I'm pleased that our actions in this effort have, by and large, stayed true to the principles I laid out from the very beginning, including my commitment to consumer-driven, market-centered, flexible, and voluntary process. In effect, this means you don't yet know which next-gen business models will ultimately prevail. On one hand, perhaps this is a chance for broadcasters to go on the offense with their own targeted advertising, or maybe will lead to a more general application of OTT-like functionality within OTA systems. Dynamic audio and visual features, and of course, advanced emergency alerting are in the mix, alongside next-generation datacasting, which our nation's public broadcasters are already starting to deploy. The point is, here's a real chance to let the market decide how a flexible standard can be utilized based on what consumers prefer. Let's dispense with the distracted efforts at rebranding or any other superfluous regulator-centric application or approaches, and allow already robust product offerings to carve their own path for consumer attention. Well, Next-Gen TV has been an example of where we've managed to simulate a freer market approach to media regulation. Much work remains to deregulate legacy industries. I remain hopeful that we can close out all open media modernization proceedings by the end of this year. In particular, I have written extensively about dispensing with the cable attribution interest record recording requirement and fixing a loophole in the timing of a program carriage complaint. However, from my conversations with members of the industry, these types of changes merely help around the edges and do not significantly reform the underlying regulatory framework. Notwithstanding this, even such modest proposals receive pushback within and outside the agency. What does this say about the mindset of so many when, despite all of the changes in the marketplace that are widely agreed upon, we still have great difficulty making even the smallest of reforms? Grasping for relevance, backward-looking officials and stakeholders refuse to lessen their grip on the remaining regulated industries. It's hard to believe how little some have learned over the last many decades of a dynamically changing communications industry. Take, for example, the cable industry, where many companies have compensated for lost video subscribers through their added broadband subscriptions, and in some cases, their OTT offerings or other intellectual property that maintains strong existing brands. It should come as no surprise that Title I services and lightly or unregulated offerings are doing reasonably well. The answer to leveling the playing field with unregulated high-tech companies is not to start subjecting the latter to more regulations, as some have purported conservatives have suggested, but to eliminate rules that are hampering legacy providers. And make no mistake, massive changes are needed if we're going to avoid sending legacy providers the way of the woolly mammoth. For starters, we should blow up the franchise model for cable regulation. Under this thinly veiled guise of local control, franchisors have subjected cable companies to discriminatory burdens in order to extract undue bounties from them. Amazingly, in some cases, local officials have even campaigned on promises of mandated network builds, additional tax revenues, and higher fees, superficially promising the preservation of local jobs. It seems obvious to any student of basic economics that the money taken from these businesses for extraneous purposes prevents them from using those funds to lower consumer bills and deploy new services. This is completely contrary to promoting network efficiencies and economics and economies of scale, both of which are features that the high-tech companies possess and use to compete head-to-head with legacy providers. It's time to get local officials out of the business of harassing cable companies. And while I acknowledge that doing away with the entire system is probably too heavy a lift for now, certain targeted reforms should be made to ease these burdens, such as ending the local review of transactions, requiring common accounting practices, preventing rights-of-way discrimination, reducing PEG and INET mandates, and standardizing consumer service requirements. Similarly, on the broadcasting front, the entire regulatory model needs to be shredded. The level of overregulation is mind-boggling. Ask yourself, why does the FCC regulate where a broadcast tower is placed so long as it doesn't cause interference with an adjacent market? Or why does the FCC prescribe how a station should maximize OTT listeners or viewers when it's already in the broadcaster's best interest to do so? Until we have the temerity to do the heavy lifting, we'll have to settle for more moderate reform. For instance, now that the incentive auction repack has been proven a success, with only a few stations needing additional time to complete their transactions, we can end the license modification freezes. In some cases, old equipment has been repeatedly patched over the last decade and is in need of replacement. Further, it's time to vastly update the failing station waiver analysis. As with so many rules, the current structure is outdated and doesn't account for certain mergers that are in the public interest and would provide increased local and live programming. In both instances, these changes to our rules could shift the focus to what truly matters to consumers, more and better local-focused programming. Before I close the topic on media marketplace reforms, it is important to address recent societal calls for more inclusion by African Americans in media business opportunities. The renewed focus on this issue is not lost on me and has appropriately forced all of us to examine the current situation and what can be done to improve the paltry representation of minority owners. And make no mistake, the dearth of African American ownership of local broadcast properties is beyond embarrassing, resting in the low single digits. To alter this, we must first acknowledge that the current state of affairs has occurred with FCC ownership limitations in place for decade after decade after decade, etc. No one should be able to say with a straight face that our rules meant to promote diversity have been anything but a complete failure. In fact, a very compelling case can be made that removing our limitations, in fact, would set the stage for more minority investment and ownership. Consider radio ownership, where allowing bigger clusters within a market could help stabilize or alternatively enhance minority-owned stations in that market. Similarly, the same outcome could occur if the newspaper broadcast limitations were struck as well, something the courts have approved numerous times, only to be foiled by claims of missing analysis. For those of us unwilling to accept the current situation, we have pushed to change the regulatory paradigm. As part of our last quadrennial review, Chairman Pai honorably led the effort to adopt a radio incubator program that would entice existing broadcaster owners to partner with minority small business entrepreneurs. It addressed the most significant elements preventing greater minority ownership, financing, and access to capital, requisite training in station operations and management, and practical experience leading to enhanced business reputations derived from involvement in successful organizations. While supporting this initiative, I was unfortunately unsuccessful in my effort to extend the program to television as well. Alas, the entire effort was upended by a few squabbling industry participants and then captured by the legal morass that is the quadrennial. Now we effectively return to the broken status quo. Absent Supreme Court intervention, it will be years before action is even considered again at the Commission. This represents a huge disappointment for the agency and a lost opportunity for society. For my last few moments, I want to discuss one of the primary missions of the Media Institute, the exercise and defense of First Amendment rights, specifically freedom of speech. Many of you have heard my past passionate criticism in speeches or statements of instances in which the First Amendment was being violated or was at risk of being undermined. Naysayers have, of course, attacked me over the years, often in bad faith and without directly engaging my arguments. That's par for the course for those of us in public life who seek to protect one of the core tenets of American democracy and society. Today, I'd like to address a particularly ominous development in this space. To be clear, the following critique is not in any way directed towards President Trump or those in the White House who are fully within their rights to call for the review of any federal statute's application, the result of which would be subject to applicable statutory and constitutional guardrails. Rather, I am very troubled by certain opportunists elsewhere who claim to be First Amendment's biggest heroes, but only come to its defense when it's convenient and constantly shift its meaning to fit their current political objectives. The inconsistencies and contradictions presented by such false prophets would make James Madison's head spin were he alive to witness them. The First Amendment protects us from limits on speech imposed by government, not private actors, and we should reject demands in the name of the First Amendment for private actors to curate or publish speech in a certain way. Like it or not, the First Amendment's protections apply to corporate entities, especially when they engage in editorial decision-making. I shudder to think of the day in which the fairness doctrine could be reincarnated for the internet, especially at the ironic behest of the so-called free speech defenders. It is time to stop allowing purveyors of First Amendment gibberish to claim that they support more speech where their actions make clear that they would actually curtail it through government action. These individuals demean and denigrate the values of our Constitution and must be held accountable for their doublespeak and dishonesty. This institution and its members have long been unwavering in defending the First Amendment, and it is the duty of each of us to continue to uphold this precious protection. So there you have my thoughts on some issues of the day. I've enjoyed speaking with you even under this format. What's even more enjoyable, however, is the interesting give and take that arises through questions and answer time. I promise to stay as long as until the last question is posed or until my wife tells me that time's up, whichever comes first. I extend my thanks again to Rick, the Media Institute, and all of you who have joined today. Thanks again.
For starting by clarifying my comments about your nomination process. I got a little carried away in saying it was the full Senate, but in fact, that leads into our first question. Will Senator Inhofe's hold on your renomination change your position on whether the FCC should consider the legato order and overturn it?
Well, look at Senator Inhofe is an American patriot. I loved my time working with him and his staff when I was on Capitol Hill. Chance to talk to him and or his staff to know more specifics than that, and I'll have to till another day.
Okay. You mentioned that one thing that would be beneficial would be to get local officials out of the business of harassing cable operators. What can the FCC do, or what's the proper role of the FCC in helping bring that about?
Look, and I think we have a lot of things we can do. I outlined 5 of them. I think 3 or 4 of those we can do ourselves. It requires a heavy lifting, and I acknowledge that. But that's part of our job. We have to recognize that the world is changing around us. The video marketplace is incredibly different than it was in 1984, or 1992, or 1996. And we have to recognize that our job is to reform our rules to be in line with the current marketplace, and recognize all the new competition that has developed and is developing on a monthly basis as you see new platforms offering services that consumers want.
Well, you say that the next gen TV model would be maybe a model for going forward, and how the regulatory approach might be structured, or?
Well, look, I'm excited about next gen TV, but the marketplace will decide whether it succeeds or fails. Broadcasters will decide whether they want to deploy it. That's the voluntary nature that the commission embedded in its rules, and I appreciate that. I push for that. I think it's inherent on broadcasters then decide which way they want to go, whether they go in next gen television or not. I tend to think they will, but what format it looks like and what are the benefits they seem to offer, not understanding the primary stream, what are the other features and functions. I outlined some of those in my speech. I mean, the AWARN system for emergency alerts, or whether it be the data casting piece that people want to relabel for God knows what reason. But there are lots of different things, the directions they can go. Some they can monetize, some may be ways to provide better stickiness for consumers to stay with the broadcasting format. So we'll just have to see. What I like from this perspective is we get to watch what's happening and recognize that it's one of the few times the broadcasters have it all in their hands to decide where they want to go.
Okay. Now, changing topics a bit, in light of today's congressional hearings on big tech, how will you and the FCC approach the calls for regulating the Silicon Valley ventures in the communications?
Well, there's kind of probably 2 parts there. One is, in a general matter, the FCC doesn't have a great deal of authority over high-tech companies that are being skewered today at the hearing. So we don't oversee a lot of their features and functions. Sometimes they go into our space, they offer a new service. Amazon's looking at a satellite offering, and that certainly gets into our bailiwick. But a lot of the things that they do don't come into our portfolio and are left to other federal government agencies, or not at all. I suspect the question probably leads to where people want to go is the Section 230 conversation. And I'm in the process of, I just received the NTIA petition, and I'm just in the process of digesting it and seeing where the chairman wants to go with it, what he plans to do with it. And I don't have any more comment than that.
Okay. When we get through the pandemic, what lessons do you think the FCC will take away from that experience? What has worked well and what needs improvement?
Well, when we get done with the pandemic, I hope that's soon. I pray for everybody that's been facing this much more worse than I have and my family have. But yeah, we've all been dealing with the uncertainty and our own little personal turmoil to go through. But what lessons have we learned, and what have been failures? I think we've learned that the state of broadband in the United States is quite strong. Those that have it have a network that hasn't buckled or bumped along the process, and we're appreciative of that because the usage has gone up. We've also seen usage change. The patterns have changed. It's no longer people driving to an urban center as we would from suburbia Arlington into Washington D.C. into the FCC headquarters. I'm taking a lot more information here and elsewhere as well, and so many people are scattered about throughout the nation. It's no longer as much hubs as it once was, and that traffic pattern does change. How the network can handle and where the management is needed at certain moments in time. So that's really a very vital point that we'll have to examine going forward. There's other pieces that are being looked at right now. Congress is examining on funding issues for different particular components, whether to add more funding for telehealth, and how what do you do on schools as we get closer to the end to next year, or I say next year, but the start of the next school year. how's that going to play out? And we're still digesting that. We certainly, I think everybody wants to see schools open safely and wants it to happen as soon as possible. I certainly want it for my children. I want it to be safe, and I want it to be open as soon as possible. This childcare issue is quite a challenge. I won't lie to you.
For sure. You're a master of process reform. What reforms do you think would have the most positive impact on intergovernmental coordination of spectrum policy?
Well, that's being examined both in Congress and NTIA. And I know they have CISMAC was looking at this in the last couple months, and I think they were talking about it yesterday. And the Congress just had a hearing on this last couple days. Look, I have a trouble with how the current landscape exists. I've testified in front of Senate Commerce Committee that the current NTIA is not functioning as it may have in the past. That's certainly a prerogative of Department of Commerce and the administration to do so. But there's lines that are being broken there, and it's causing agencies that feel the spectrum decisions are going against them to do end runs on the Department of Commerce and going right to the Hill and seeking redress there and using their political friends up there to try and change the dynamics on some of our decisions. And that hadn't in the past. I think that NTIA used to act as more of a mediator to shoo away those arguments that were not compelling and to fight for only those that were really meritorious. And we've lost that, I think. I don't know if it's going to change anytime soon, but that's something that needs to be looked at. And that structure, how do you deal with things? And I've put forward a number of different ideas on process reform. Federal agencies have to have evaluation for the spectrum they're sitting on. We require every government entity to buy certain things. They buy pencils, they buy pens, they buy equipment. They don't get it for free. Some agencies live on land that's free, but most don't. The FCC is moving because the cost of our rent was too high per person. So we're moving across town to a place I don't want to be. So everything that almost every agency has to pay certain costs, but for spectrum, they're giving it for free, and there's no incentive to make it more efficient, and that's incredibly problematic. So not only doing evaluation, but we also need, and one of my colleagues is very good at offering up different benefits that we should be giving to federal agencies. I'm kind of the opposite. We need more sticks. We're going to need to be able to push federal agencies to be more efficient, and I suspect, and I've advocated that we have to make this part of their budget. The valuation of spectrum should go into their budget. So there's a cost to holding and sitting on spectrum bands that they may not be using efficiently, that they could migrate for more efficient equipment, that they could then release for commercial purposes, which absolutely is necessary. We know that US wireless providers need more commercial licensed spectrum, and that's our job to try and figure out how we can make that happen. And I'm pushing on multiple bands in this front. Well, I'll give you an example. 3.1 to 3.55. That spectrum has been fought over for many years, and we thought we were getting to an end point, and the rug got pulled under our feet, pulled off under our feet, and now we're back to the starting point. And what I'm getting the impression is we're finally getting close to that top 100. That top 100 might be released in the near future, is what I understand. And we got to keep pushing for more than that. We need more than just the top 100, but that would be a benefit, and I appreciate anyone who's doing work on that.
Okay. Now here's an interesting one. Where is your look at payola, and where does it go next?
Sure. Well, we did an inquiry to all of the major recording industry participants, asked them to answer multiple questions, and then we put them out for comment and said basically to the public, if anything that they have responded to, if any comment that they have, if you have any tangible documented evidence, please submit it. We will take it, we'll review it and see if there's something. And not one person, not one single soul has come forward and provided us any more information. So I take until someone proves different, the recording industry has provided answers, and I have to take them at their word until something suggests otherwise, and that hasn't been forthcoming. So right now, I wouldn't say it's on hold. I think it's been satisfactorily answered in the meantime. Things can change. DC, things can change quickly. But right now, I'm on the information the answers that have been provided are sufficient for my purpose, and I'm waiting for someone else to prove it wrong.
Okay. You mentioned that the Commission's diversity rules have been a complete failure, as you put it, and you mentioned some initiatives that have been tried. What do you see as the next generation of diversity rules or attempts to really make some progress in that field?
I'm not optimistic right at the moment. I mean, I really applaud the chairman for moving forward on the incubator program. And I think we're stuck for a good amount of period. Unless Congress changes the dynamics, I think we're stuck. I'm not expecting the quadrennial to come back anytime soon. I'm very hopeful the Supreme Court will take up the case that the Third Circuit sent back to us. I have advocated long ago that the Supreme Court had to answer the issues because the Third Circuit was just stuck in kept us stuck in a rut, and we weren't making any progress on any front. And so I'm not optimistic we're going to see any changes anytime soon, and that means no beneficial activity on the diversity issues. And as I mentioned in my speech, if you look at the paltry numbers that exist today under our current regime, many of those things have been on the books for decades upon decades, and they haven't worked. It should be our job, as I mentioned on the previous question, it's our job to modernize our rules, and we did what Congress asked. It used to be a biennial review, and I kind of joked about that in my speech. Now it's a quadrennial review. The FCC came to us and said, "Oh, when I worked in Congress, it's too burdensome to do it every 2 years. Too much work. Oh my goodness, can't do it." So now we make it every 4 years, and we still don't do it on time, and we still don't do a sufficient job to what actually would measure up with the current marketplace. Most of our rules need to be completely struck, given what's happened in video and audio space. And who is competing against those entities. The legacy providers are facing so many new voices in their space and time and commitments against their advertising dollars and elsewise. And so we need to reform that. I'm just not optimistic that anything can be done, no matter what the lay of the government looks like.
Okay. So another question related to the pandemic. During the pandemic, television is critical, particularly in areas without broadband. Do you envision partnerships between TV licensees and 5G providers?
Interesting question. I imagine that absolutely so. You'll see some. I couldn't tell you what they're going to look like, or if they're going to be the big players or the more small rural players. I just don't know at the current time. But yes, absolutely. And to the first part of the question, TV broadcasting has become more important. Certainly, journalism and local news has become more important. I'm certainly, as a viewer, interested in what's happening in my local community as it relates to COVID and what do the numbers look like in hospitalization and death rates that matter to me rather than nationwide numbers. And the same thing with politics and elsewise. And so I really applaud our local broadcasters. I applaud our national broadcasters and what they're able to do day in and day out and provide service to the American people, and the benefits that they bring forward is amazing. So I do think there's partnerships to be had. I think that the entire industry is going to go through, and I say every sector of our little universe is going to go through some partnerships and a shakeout at some point. I remember when I first joined the commission, there was a conversation of, some very smart people came forward and said, in about 10 years, there's probably going to be about 6 big companies. And they're all going to offer everything, and they're going to fight each other. Most of them will have a backing or be a partner with the high-tech companies that are now having the hearing on Capitol Hill and other hearings they've had before. So that was very insightful at the time, and I've been mindful of that. It certainly has been echoed multiple times in trips to New York when you hear from investors and managers of funds or what they really see going to happen over time. And so I'm mindful of that, but it's not lost on me what the value of localism is and what it means to the American people. So we're trying to balance all of that and recognize that our rules need to modernize, and in some instances we do, and we are moving forward. In other instances, we're not doing far enough, and in some instances we're stuck by court decisions.
You think the newspaper broadcast cross ownership rule will ever go away in your lifetime?
My lifetime, yes. I plan to live quite a while, so unless God be willing, unless He changes the course for my history, I'd like to, absolutely, it will go away. And look, it may be that there'll be only 4 or 5, and I've testified to this. There may be at the time that it goes away, there are only 4 or 5 newspapers left, and we're moving in that direction. There are only 3 or 4 that actually make money now. It's a matter of time before the rest will collapse before our very eyes. We've seen so many already. We've seen the bankruptcies. We've seen the collapse of local journalism in newsprint. It's so problematic, and I'm not saying that newspaper broadcast ownership, cross ownership would have been the savior, but it certainly could have provided over the years a new bidding player in the marketplace. It could provide a voice, and there's definitely in those instances we already know, because they do exist today under waivers. We know that there are synergies to be had. I've visited those stations. I've visited those print operations. I've seen them, and it's very interesting on how they operate and how they're able to both fulfill the needs of the local community in very diverse ways, while still trying to, still function and make money. So it's very depressing. And I do have those conversations with broadcasters when we were able to travel. We're not traveling right now, but when we did travel, I would ask them, if tomorrow the newspaper broadcast ownership, cross ownership rules changed and finalized, and the court blessed them, would you buy a newspaper? And there are a couple that say there's a partnership here, there's partnership here, there's 4 or 5 different things we could make happen, and those are all being lost by a rule that makes no longer any sense and is stuck in the court system.
Yeah, it's just won't go away no matter what anybody does. Going back to 5G for a minute, what are your sense generally on the status of 5G development and your sense of how it's coming along? Are you satisfied with the progress? Or?
Well, look, there's no doubt that the pandemic has slowed some aspects of deployment, but I'm really impressed that the U.S. wireless providers have been able to get as far as they have in the marketplace. They are, at the forefront of the race to 5G. It's not just about a race against China, as some people try to characterize it. There's 4 or 5 countries that want to be the preeminent wireless provider, in terms of 5G services offered globally. And it's important for the U.S. position to be there, not only for what it brings for economic benefits to the United States. There was a great report out today in terms of the benefits that 4G brought from CTIA. And you look and say, we want to make sure that's replicated going forward to 5G, but not understanding all the economic benefits and the economic productivity that come from that. We want to be at the forefront of what are those rules that govern the system, that govern 5G going forward? What is that app universe, the innovation that flows from that? What are the standards, and are they open going forward? Are we going to have a China structure that's going to close things in the back end? So it's really important that it is a real race. Those people who deny it are really missing the boat. And so I think that U.S. wireless providers are doing a wonderful job. I've been very impressed on how the network has held up. Both the wireline and the wireless networks have held up. Certainly mobility is so important to the American people and will continue to be. And I believe that they're going to continue to roll out 5G and have been, and working through different issues. We have a job we have a job to make sure the spectrum's available. And that's what I spend a great deal of my time. I mentioned 3.1 to 3.55 and how critical that is to add to the portfolio of things that I've already worked so hard to happen. CBRS, C-band. I was at the forefront of C-band before anyone else was even talking about it. I was trying to figure out how to make it happen. And now everyone's talking about speed. I gave that speech 3 years ago about speed. And now we're finally getting to that point. And we're going to see the auction in December. People talk about being a $50 billion auction. It doesn't really bother me what the number is. We'll just have to see where it plays out in terms of auction revenue. But in terms of getting that 280 megahertz, which I was able to deliver on, that's critical to me. Getting that into the marketplace for commercial wireless providers, so key.
Hey, thanks, Commissioner. Well, we're coming down to our time limit, so I think that will be the last word here today. But I want to thank you so much for being with us in this virtual format, and thanks for your patience and waiting these months until we sorted out how we were going to do this. And it's been great to have you here, and we really appreciate your insights and your thoughts on where things stand and where they're going. So thank you very much, Commissioner.
Well, thank you, Rick, and thank you for everyone who attended and watched, and I look forward to helping in the future. Anything I can do, please do let me know.
We sure will. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I'd like to thank all our sponsors as we wrap up here, and special thanks to Ireland Communications and LG Electronics. And let me invite all of you out there to please join us on August 27th as we hear from our Media Institute Distinguished Fellow, Stuart Brotman. Thank you for being with us today. We'll see you next time.
Thank you to our special guest speaker today. Thank you to the Navy Band. And thank you again to our sponsors. See you next month.